Hello, good evening or good afternoon. I'm not sure which it is, but anyway, good evening. It's lovely to have you with us at Advantage Schools. My name is Stuart Locke. I'm the CEO at Advantage Schools. We're a small school trust based in Bedford and Bedfordshire. We're really excited to have you with us this evening. I'll introduce my colleagues in just a minute. What I want to say is thank you for joining us during the next couple of hours. Actually, we're hopeful that we haven't overplanned and it'll be quite a bit shorter than that. But during the next couple of hours, we're happy to answer any questions about our experience of the EIF and our Ofsted inspections in early 2020. And with Ofsted coming back, we thought it was useful to share with colleagues across the country and particularly locally about our experiences. Please use the Q&A chat function below. What I want to say, first of all, is that I'm not a big fan of the title of our talk about preparing for Ofsted. And the reason for that is because I am unsure that schools that spend all their time doing things because of Ofsted or preparing for Ofsted or spending a significant amount of time that they could be spending improving their schools in other ways, really producing things that are for show for Ofsted, are schools that run as well as they possibly can. In some ways, I think that they can and do fall foul of Ofsted, and we have some. Well, I certainly have some confidence in the new evidence inspection framework that it rewards schools that do the right thing and run great schools. So I'm not a big fan of the title that we've got, but nonetheless, we felt like our approach, and we're going to try and show this to you over the next however long we take, our approach of just running great schools and trusting that Ofsted will look after itself. That we thought we would unpick some of the things that particularly leaders and people across our trust that helped us through the Ofsted inspection. So I think that's useful for me to outline at the start. This evening I'm joined by my colleagues Jenny Hill, who's our Chief Financial Officer, Simon Campbell, who's our Chief Operating Officer across Advantage Schools, Sally Stanton, our Director of Education, Tim Blake, who's the Principal at Bedford Free School, and Samantha Baxter, who's the Principal at Elstow School in Bedford. And I think, and Sophie Heron, our Executive Assistant, is backstage sharing her screen and supporting us with hopefully everything going smoothly with regard to our presentation. So now that I've introduced people and started, I'm going to come back in a minute, but we're going to hear from Sally primarily about some of the changes, and we thought it was good to start with this, some of the changes to the Ofsted framework and the practice that Ofsted have, just to remind people before we go into our experience in early 2020. Sally.
Thank you, Stuart. So as Stuart said, I just wanted to make it really clear, obviously I am a member of staff at the Trust, I'm Director of Education, and I am absolutely not a spokesperson or an authority from Ofsted. So the information I'm going to share is basically the information I've gleaned through going through the handbooks and going through the summary of changes document published by Ofsted, which is the sort of thing I see it as my role to keep on top of to best support our schools and our principals. And we thought it'd be really useful actually to start this presentation outlining some of those changes for you, given that inspectors are now returning to schools. So moving on to the next slide, and thinking about the schools that actually will be inspected or can expect to be inspected this half term. We can expect Section 8 inspections of schools graded inadequate or requires improvement at their last 2 consecutive full inspections, and Section 8 inspections of good schools that have not been inspected within the statutory 5-year window as a result of the pandemic. And obviously schools will be inspected if significant concerns are raised. Outstanding schools, they can request an inspection. So if you were in that position and you wanted to do that, you would write to the regional director. Now, primaries have been able to be inspected from the 4th of May. Secondaries will be open to inspection from half term, obviously, unless there are significant concerns raised before half term. And that's in recognition of the need that secondary schools have at the moment to focus on qualification and assessment requirements. And just to clarify, the inspections will be on-site, in-person inspections. So thinking about actually what might be different, and one of the things that has changed is that the outstanding school exemption has now officially been removed. However, these schools aren't priority for inspection this term. As I've just said, it's other schools that Ofsted are prioritising seeing. But Ofsted does intend to inspect all schools that had the outstanding inspection by August 2026. And they will work through that in terms of any schools that were last inspected under Section 5 before 2015. They can expect to get a Section 5 fully graded inspection, and if it was after 2015, they can expect a Section 8 initial inspection. On that last point, if there's evidence the school is no longer outstanding, a Section 5 will normally be scheduled to take place within a year and definitely before the 1st of August 2027. But obviously, again, any significant concerns could result in a conversion to a full Section 5 inspection. And in terms of new schools, because obviously new schools or schools undergoing significant change would normally expect an inspection within the window, but most schools, should it receive an inspection, Ofsted are basically saying it's about a year and a term after it would have otherwise taken place due to kind of the impact of the pandemic and needing to catch up on some of that. So can inspection gradings go up? So Section 8 monitoring inspections don't change grades. But what inspectors can do is, if a school is inadequate, they can convert to a Section 5, which then would be graded. So if they think that a school has improvement and has the potential to go up, they can make that conversion. And they can recommend a full Section 5 inspection for any requires improvement schools to take place before the end of term. Equally, can inspection grades go down? So again, the Section 8 you can't change the grades through the Section 8 monitoring inspections, but any concerns would mean that an inspector could convert to a Section 5, which then would be graded. However, Ofsted have said very clearly they fully expect the majority of inspections to remain Section 8 inspections. And obviously, if there is a conversion to a Section 5, it doesn't mean downgrading is inevitable. It just means that they want to look in more detail and have that option. So some of the things that I think it is really useful to be aware of is around the changes made to the inspection handbook. They were updated on the 19th of April. So if you're working from old versions of the handbook and you're expecting a visit, it would be a really good idea to make sure you've had a look at the updated version. And there is also a document on the Ofsted website that outlines where you can find the changes. I'm just going to go through the real headline kind of big things that I think you'd want to be aware of here. So the main focus of inspections is largely unchanged. There's the big focus on curriculum. So where the new inspection framework came in before the pandemic, that's still the real core of the inspection framework. But there have been some changes made as a result of the pandemic. So, for example, the phone call that you initially have before the inspection, actually Ofsted have said it may now be longer than 90 minutes, and that's because they want to explore the impact of the pandemic. Leaders will be asked about the remote education that they provided, what work they've done to keep people safe, how they communicated with families, how they've promoted well-being, and they'll really be seeking to try to build a picture of how the school's been impacted by the pandemic as well. So what have you seen in your schools as a result of the pandemic? Meetings will be remote where possible or where appropriate. So obviously they'll be in school, but if they're going to meet with groups, they might ask to have that arranged to be done remotely if necessary. In terms of the curriculum, so obviously a lot of us have identified changes that we feel we might need to make in response to the pandemic. And what Ofsted have said they'll be looking into is what have you identified as changes that you think need to take place, and what are you doing as leaders to take action to see those changes through? So bear in mind that's about your curriculum intent there, sort of the curriculum intent, what are you intending your curriculum to be, may have altered as a result of the pandemic. And as before, implementation is just how effectively is that curriculum then learned by the pupils. But there are some additional points relating to the arrangements you have for education through the pandemic. So, for example, the curriculum implementation strand now includes looking at remote education. They've said they won't base judgments on the quality of education delivered in the first lockdown, but they will be looking at what is now in place for pupils that are needing to isolate for local or other lockdowns that might happen. And if you do have some pupils being educated remotely during the inspection, they may well ask to review materials or observe that teaching. And they may want to discuss with parents, teachers and pupils and look at some of the work that's being completed remotely. So there will be some triangulation of data around what they see happening there. They have said they won't be asking to see recordings of live lessons unless, and I think this unless is quite key, you normally would have them stored for staff or pupil future use. So if you are habitually recording some of your content for future use or maybe for training, it may well be that they if you have that, they might ask to see it. And I think this, to me, that feeds into that idea of they don't want us to do things for Ofsted. So they're not going to say, we want you to start recording your live lessons so that we can see them. But if you actually are doing that anyway, it might be something that it is helpful for them to have a look at. To clarify, as before lockdown and in line with the new framework, they are still not looking at internal progress data. So the CAGs from last year and the tags from this year, if you're at secondary school, won't be used to assess the impact of your curriculum. Moving forward, with the outstanding judgment, just to remind you that from September 2019, this is no longer a best fit judgment, and it remains the case that to achieve outstanding, a school must meet all securely and consistently. And I think that's probably a good point for me to hand over to Stuart and for us to start getting into the detail about our experience of Ofsted.
Thanks so much, Sally. And of course, that last bit on outstanding was really something we went through, and I'm sure you'll hear from Tim in more detail about how they went through every single criteria for outstanding at Bedford Free School, really unpicking whether they could award that grade. So I just want to repeat something that Sally said. We're not experts in Ofsted, and we're certainly not telling anybody in how to manage their inspections or prepare for their inspections. We're just going to tell you what we did and what we do, and I'm aware that that won't apply necessarily to everybody. We have established a significant central team in our trust which took lots of the work off principals and off school staff, and so we know that not everyone's in the same situation. So take from it what you will. Please bear with us if we end up talking about something that isn't strictly related to you, but we'll try our best to talk to you about what happened. So we were lucky enough in January of 2020, not long before the pandemic started, to have both of our schools inspected one week after another. To skip to the end and to spoil the surprise, our primary school, Elstow, was graded as good. That was a Section 8 inspection. Sally's already talked about how that's a monitoring inspection, and certainly prior to the pandemic, most Section 8 inspections were of good schools to check that the school continues to be good. So the outcome is usually that it either continues to be good or that it requires a Section 5 at its next inspection, either to move up possibly to outstanding or because it slipped back somewhat. We found that Elstow continues to be a good school was the outcome of that inspection, and that's what we expected. We think Elstow is significantly improved, and we were anticipating, and we still anticipate when they come back, really improved outcomes, but we didn't at that stage think that the outcomes were sufficient for us to argue for anything more than that. And then the inspection of Bedford Free School, which I'll outline in a minute, is one that we asked for, showed the school to be outstanding in all categories. Partly, you know, we knew that was that we had a good shot at that. And the reason that we asked for the inspection, and I remember that the regional HMI was very surprised when we asked for the inspection. He said there weren't very many who were brave enough to go for to ask for an inspection under the new framework before lots of schools had been done. But the reason we asked was because we felt that, I mean, I said earlier that I'm really a fan of the direction of travel of Ofsted under Her Majesty's Chief Inspector, under Amanda Spielman. And the reason for that is because we feel like they've focused on the substance of education, and it almost felt to us like Ofsted had caught up with our perspective on education. They caught up with the fact that we'd predominantly focused on the substance of what pupils learn for quite some time before the EIF came into place. So we believed we had a good shot at outstanding. We knew we wouldn't get any worse than good, so we thought we would have a go at that, and we were fortunate enough to get to there. And if I outline the vision that we publish on our website and in our literature, our vision is that we believe, given the right circumstances, all pupils are capable of extraordinary things, and we go on to talk about our vision there. And we very often within our trust talk about our pupils having the entitlement as young adults to join the community of educated citizens. And when we start to unpick that, we start to unpick that they are entitled to the knowledge that educated people take for granted, the sort of knowledge that you might come to the fore when you see a newspaper headline, like we often use NATO in Libya, catch 22. The amount of geographical, historic, political and so on knowledge that comes to the fore in order that educated people can understand the thrust of that headline is something that we think that all young people are entitled to. The sort of knowledge that comes to the fore when we talk about Good Samaritans, or when we read works of literature or visit art galleries or enjoy really fantastic pieces of classical music, is a sort of knowledge that we want all of our pupils to be inducted to. And the reason that we think that that is that aligns somewhat with the Ofsted framework and where they were going was because we found that that when you start to unpick what that means for a school curriculum and for the entitlement that we give to our young people, it means that we start to unpick the knowledge they're entitled to, and we start to unpick what is the core and what is the stuff that they have to encounter. And when we start to do that with a structure around the disciplines, the subjects, what we call the distinctive quests for truth that subjects represent, when we start to really unpick what that means for each individual subject and develop our curriculum in that way, we've got a curriculum intent. We didn't write any curriculum intent statements. We didn't write intent statements for each individual subject, but we did ask, way prior to Ofsted, what is the point in your subject, to each of our teachers and I mean at primary and at secondary, and we asked that not threateningly, but what is it contributing to our aim of all of our pupils joining a community of educated citizens? And if you can answer that, you start to get an understanding of a curriculum intent, the intent that we have for our curriculum and the entitlement for our young people. And because we've done that work for some significant time, because in each of our schools we unpick progression through the curriculum as the progression that pupils need to, if they learn the curriculum, they're making progress because we've established the curriculum like that, then our curriculum intent is well known across our schools, and there isn't any need for us to respond to the 3 I's or anything like that by developing random extra things to show to Ofsted when they walk in. Like 20 years ago, when I don't know if anybody is of the same experience, when we used to produce like buckets or rooms full of folders for Ofsted inspectors to look through. So very much our kind of vision and our curricular vision for our schools and our trust is what leads to our curriculum intent and so on. And I was lucky enough a few years ago to be amongst a group of educators, largely centered around Cambridge actually, who used the phrase, the curriculum is the progression model, the idea that we don't need national curriculum levels or GCSE grades all the way through the pupils' education. We need to establish a really firm curriculum and then find out if they've learnt it. And if they've learnt it, they're making progress. That idea that the curriculum is the progression model, and everything that statement unpicks, that's now common parlance within Ofsted, and I'm really pleased to see it. But it means that the substance is really at the root of it. And if you think about that, that's really when we talk about impact. I've gone way ahead in my slides. I should have said, if we look at the next slide, the slide on our people, that we did have all of these people, and we do have all of these people in our central trust team, or working in our central trust team, at least to some extent. And so I'm aware that not everybody has all of these things available to them in order to take lots of the headaches off of school leaders and make sure that they can focus on the curriculum, the delivery of the curriculum, the pedagogy, the if we want to use Ofsted language, what's the word, the implementation. Like we're aware that not everybody has all of these things available to them in order to take some of those away, but it does mean that our whole organisation is focused on the real substance of education, and it's the reason that we felt like we had a good shot with the new Ofsted framework. If we go on to the next slide, one of the things we say in our organisation, I think this sets us up really well, is that some organisations talk about their non-negotiables. We talk about our shared expectations, that we demand high expectations, we expect there to be positive outcomes, but it is not acceptable for those outcomes to come from hot housing, to come from entering pupils for easier qualifications. We believe in an academic curriculum for all, because that's where our intention, our vision for the curriculum, our young people should be entitled to join a community of educated citizens really comes from. And that does mean all pupils via curricular focus. It really dictates our approach to inclusion as well, and that's really important. We do think that if the tragedy is if you don't have that knowledge that is taken for granted by educated people by the age of 16, 17, 18, you're likely to be excluded from that community for life. And to us, that's a real, that's really how we view inclusion. We expect this for all young people. So high expectations, we think outcomes look after themselves. We hence think the Ofsted inspections should look after themselves as well. We expect our leaders to sweat the small stuff. Our leaders are expected to visit every classroom, every lesson in each of our schools. That doesn't mean every leader, every class, but a leader should visit every class, every lesson, and should not pass the buck, because we should be making sure that we know our schools in a very, very low stakes manner, but B, actually we take control and we're on the same side as teachers and support staff, so that success is desirable, demanded and achievable in our schools. And desirable, demanded and achievable are words that we unpick quite regularly when talking about our curricular vision as well. And the final shared expectation for us is that we employ people to do their job and do it well. We reward people who are really effective at their job in the time that they get, and we don't tolerate underperformance. And we think that because young people only have one opportunity. And this all is the backdrop to why we think that our schools run really well, and that we are able to succeed in our Ofsted. We were able to succeed in our Ofsted inspections. Having said that, looking at the next slide, it wouldn't be true to say we did absolutely nothing for Ofsted and just waited till they turned up. I think that would be somewhat foolish. Although I would argue that we did far less, and most of it was done centrally, than we would do than I think many other schools would do, and schools certainly that are nervous about their inspections. So one of the things we have is a Trust Ofsted handbook, something that I wrote, and I'll show you a bit of it in a minute. It's not something we tend to distribute to other people, partly because it's our best bet for how we run our schools, partly because we think it can drive the narrative in the sector that we have to do different things for Ofsted, and I don't think that's helpful. It tries to outline some of the things that we do and make sure they come to the fore when colleagues are under pressure during the inspection. And it's designed largely for school leaders, with a couple of things that I'll show you in a minute. We do have some reminders, procedures and questions that we make sure colleagues are ready for. We do expect leaders to know the Section 5 and the Section 8 handbook. I think it's foolish not to, because I do think that Ofsted inspectors have had some great training over the last few years, but like any group, they're a mixed ability bunch, and you might need to argue your case with them. And that isn't to insult any of them in particular, or insult any of them at all, actually. I think that they've had some great training, as I say, and I agree with the direction of travel for Ofsted. But I think it's the responsibility of leaders to be ready to point out where your school aligns with some of the criteria that's in the handbook. We do have a CEF, we have that anyway. Like I know you don't have to have a CEF, we do. And we do expect leaders to be on top of the information about their schools. We basically expect leaders to know which pupils are learning in which subjects and which are not. And we have an extensive procedure, we call it data-driven instruction, although it's not really data, it's really more about information, that is very low stakes, really light touch, but means that we touch on every pupil at least every 5 weeks in each of our schools. It's something that Sally and I are going to do some work on, because often when we present on anything, actually, and we mentioned DDI, and we say we don't do any marking, we do feedback, and we do lots of other things that really support our teachers, and it means we get great outcomes, and our assessment system is this. People often say, I want that assessment system, and unfortunately it took us about 3 years to develop properly and embed. It's really hard to give to somebody or give to a school and them to kind of replicate it, and they often try and replicate it immediately. So we're going to write about kind of the principles behind it, and perhaps do a couple of seminars on that. Anyway, I said I'd show you a bit of the Trust Ofsted handbook, which is on the next slide. So for example, this, it starts off with things like this. This is what we expect the leadership team to deal with. And as Sally's just said, that the opening phone call can be more than 90 minutes long. One of the important things that I outlined to colleagues is that in that phone call, I think it's worth asking the lead inspector if your deputy, your SENCO in particular, because there's a really important focus on SEN, and perhaps somebody taking notes can be in that phone call, at least listening. We found that really helpful in both of the inspections, and actually I asked Sam and Tim to ask if I could be there as well. Partly because it allows a collective understanding of the conclusions that the inspector has drawn from the available information publicly, from the publicly available information, partly because it allows some people to concentrate on what they're saying to the inspector and talking about, and partly because I don't believe that a head teacher knows everything about their school, and I wouldn't expect them to. I'd expect them to be focused on the core business, but also to have, that's the reason we have a leadership team. But we go through a number of these things. If you go on to the next slide, these, for example, were this was from a request. Actually, we had some colleagues who were very nervous about what they can expect when inspectors walk into their classroom, and it's like, well, just do the things you normally do and have the things you normally have available. And they're like, but I know what they are, but what are they? Like, how can I? And so they effectively wanted a tick list. None of this are things that we wouldn't expect people to do and know anyway. So we'd expect them to know the wider curriculum, where their lesson fits in with the sequence of lessons or the curriculum, including at primary, where we have our subject leaders present to the whole staff on the progress of their subject from early years right through to year 6, and actually beyond into secondary, making sure that everyone is aware of the progression of each subject over time, even if you can't remember everything. We expect the pupil mark book, we call it a messy mark book. It's a subject-specific mark book. That means effectively subjects decide what it looks like, but we don't believe you can hold all assessment information in your head and know everything about pupils. And so we ask you to take notes on any assessment information. We never inspect that, but we expect you to be able to talk about it, and so on. And really, all of those are expected, and I've given you a sample there. The only section that's different really is we wrote section 8, which is that inspectors generally, and Sam and Tim will talk about this, so part 8, which is on the slide before, Sophie, which is inspectors, they don't just walk into a lesson and give you feedback. They walk into a lesson, see what they see, perhaps go and investigate 2 or 3 of the pupils' work from that lesson, maybe ask for 2 or 3 of those pupils, or even more, to speak to them in a separate meeting, and then they'll talk to the teacher, not with feedback, but with questions about where that fits into the curriculum, what's normal, and so on. And you'll see that contribute to DDI as a contribution there. DDI is data-driven instruction that I described earlier, our assessment system that's low touch, low stakes. I am done with that slide now, Sophie. Thank you. And then we did a couple of things for leaders, like these questions here that are in the handbook are not for us to produce massive long answers to, because we don't go like some people for a job interview are like, tell me the 100 questions that are most likely to come from a job interview. We just don't think that happens. We think Ofsted inspectors are better trained like that. But we did ask some questions that allow people to start to talk about the substance of curriculum, the stuff they know, but particularly for middle leaders, so they weren't nervous about what was going to come out in any, this is at secondary in particular, I think, but actually at primary as well, what was going to come out in terms of like trying to unpick the curriculum that we developed and how we developed it. And I think this was important for us to be able to prepare middle leaders. Probably like we used it largely the night before. We asked leaders in advance, particularly at BFS, where we were expecting the inspection. We weren't expecting the inspection at Elstow at all, actually, but particularly allowed to say to senior leaders, do you think our middle leaders are capable of answering questions like this, fluently and so on? And is anybody going to get really nervous? Those sorts of things are really important, by the way, for the opening conversation with the lead inspector, who we found in both cases, the lead inspector was really open to discussions about colleagues who were nervous, who had issues and so on. I think I'm going into Sam and Tim's area, so I'm going to pause slightly. And just on the next slide, please, Sophie. A couple of other things that we, so this is the bottom of the page that we just showed you, partly for senior leaders, but partly for teachers as well. And then the one thing that we did do on the next slide is that I spent some significant time, and the number 0 there is because I thought of it after I'd done the rest of the page and then didn't update it in a timely manner, so it's a bit unprofessional, but I prepared governors really as well as I could. Not our trust board are really professional, and we have a great deal of expertise in our trust board. We take it very seriously, and we take local governance very seriously as well, and we have a significant amount of expertise in local governance, but local governors got particularly nervous over the prospect of Ofsted inspections and repeatedly asked for significant training over what can be expected for them. And so I went through with local governors for a couple of hours in both cases, what they might expect at an Ofsted inspection, the sort of thing we expect them to know, which they're reassured by because they generally know it, and then the sort of thing that we might have gaps in and we might want to discuss about, which actually allows us to create a plan for governance moving forward anyway, not just for Ofsted. The alignment of the Ofsted, the direction of Ofsted at least, even if they haven't gone quite as far as I'd like, with what we want for our schools and our young people has been really convenient in terms of marrying them up. But I do hope that you will hear, particularly from the principals, from Sam and from Tim over the next however long it takes, about how like it isn't that we just prepared loads and loads of things for Ofsted. I think hopefully you're getting that idea now, but that actually we run our schools as well as we can. We do the things that we think are right, and then we let our Ofsted inspections, the same as actually we let our outcomes take care of themselves because we put the correct input in. I think that's the end of my part. Just want to check on the next slide. Sally.
Thank you. So go on.
I was going to say, I should say, do ask questions and so on, because while I'm sitting here listening and so on, I'm really happy to answer any questions people have. And if they're going to come up, we'll ignore them and allow them to be answered in the course of time. But if you have any questions, do type them in.
So as Stuart's mentioned, I really do acknowledge that when we got the call, we were at a bit of an advantage because we had put so much work into really carefully looking at, reviewing and curating our curriculum. And that had been going on before the Ofsted framework changed. So I know that that puts us in a really good position, and that different people are at different journeys. But so we accept that we were somewhat ahead on that journey in curriculum development, and but I just want to kind of talk through how looking at the curriculum and having a particular way of shaping and supporting teachers around the curriculum really helped us with our Ofsted inspections. So I'm sure you're probably familiar with the metaphor. People talk about curriculum as a roadmap or the pupil journey through the school curriculum. But I want to steal an idea that I actually got from Christine Council, and it's a metaphor that I think is really beautiful and for me really sums up the complexity of curriculum and looking after the curriculum. And she argues that curriculum is actually more than a road, more than a roadmap. It's more like the waterways of Venice. And if you think about Venice, those canals and those waterways need very specialist maintenance if they are actually going to take you where you want to go. So the journey is one thing, but there's also that experience of traveling through the waterways of Venice, which is just incredible. And that journey in itself is a rewarding experience. But also the waters, they don't stand alone. So if you think about how interconnected the canals are, the waters then flowing between the canals are interconnected. And that's, in a way, a great way of thinking about learning, those connections that pupils make or that we can make with one part of the curriculum serving the other, but actually in ways that are very, very difficult to measure. And of course, they're all feeding into, but also drawing upon the much larger oceans around, which I would say represent the subject disciplines. So Venice needs a huge amount of maintenance to remain as beautiful as it is. And I think the same is true of a great curriculum. It needs constant care, constant review, nurture, curation. And you're not kind of just talking about those individual areas, which obviously your subject leaders have a really good eye on, but somebody in the school has to, or people in the school need to have that collective vision as well of how it all works together. So we have leaders in our schools who understand this very thoroughly and actually take real pride in that curriculum work. And that means that we have a really clear and coherent vision of what curriculum means to us. And I think that's been very clear in what Stuart's talked about across the trust. There's a very strong shared understanding of how curriculum is so important, how it offers such transformation to people's lives if we can get the curriculum as good as we can. And so therefore, everybody puts a lot of work into making that vision a reality for the children in our schools. So yep, we do have detailed curriculum maps, and we do know what we expect children to learn. We have really high quality curriculum resources in place already. We've really thought about how learning builds on prior learning, how we can make those links forwards and backwards through the curriculum. And as Stuart mentioned, assessment systems that really truly treat the curriculum as the progression model, so that when we're talking about assessing pupils, we're talking about how much of the curriculum have they learned, how much has been retained. And really, if we can move on to the next slide about professional learning, because quite an important aspect of this is making sure that we then are able to support staff to deliver that curriculum as effectively as possible. So one of the things that was commented on in the reports was around the training that staff had, and where it was very specifically linked to what staff needed in order to achieve those really ambitious curriculum goals. Because it's all very well to say you've got an ambitious curriculum and you've got high expectations for pupils, but actually, what is it that the staff really need that will enable them to deliver that curriculum in the optimal way to make sure that you're absolutely maximising pupils' chances of benefiting from that curriculum. So if you're going to have an ambitious curriculum, you need the well-trained staff, you need to really understand the importance of curriculum materials, and we spend a lot of time looking at our understanding of cognitive science and what can we do to help students learn. And the goal of this, really, I'd say, is to try our hardest to make sure that wherever a pupil is in our school, they consistently can expect a high quality experience. Everybody needs to get a good deal because they all deserve that without question. So I think it's kind of, I've heard people talk about, and I think it's generally acknowledged that, you know, from an outside position, people compare schools, but actually within schools, there's often great disparity between a classroom where something wonderful is happening and a classroom where somebody maybe needs support to make sure pupils are learning as well as they can. And I kind of think of it as, you know, in our primary school, if we've got a teacher who absolutely loves history, reads loads about history, really geeks out on history, and they love teaching it to the pupils in that room are probably going to get a really good deal. How can we make sure that the pupils in the other classes also get a really good deal where their teacher is maybe much more into art? And equally, if that teacher is really into art, how can we share their expertise so that nothing's left to chance? We want to make sure everyone gets that opportunity. So we have like a very specific, we actually have, I think of it as our curriculum for staff training. And we have a focus on school culture, curriculum, obviously, because we need everybody to understand the vision and their role in that vision, cognitive science, and then we really try as much as possible to drill down into the detail of subjects and disciplines. So what we tend to do as a trust is we'll take on kind of that sort of generic training as far as we can around culture, curriculum and cognitive science, and then that gives the schools the freedom to focus on actually what is it that our staff really need to develop their subject teaching, and you know, I'm talking about primary here as well as secondary, kind of, because especially for primary teachers there is a lot that teachers need to know to deliver across the curriculum. So how can we support that subject knowledge as much as possible? So as soon as the foundations are in place, we work on that subject specific training, and that was something that was commented on very positively during the inspection and in the report. And you know, actually this core training that you can see on this slide here, this is in addition to what you would be doing in your schools anyway. So, you know, recently we've kind of done a lot of training at our primary school around maths, because we think it's an area where we really wanted to develop the maths provision, so they can get on with doing that because they know that the other stuff has been looked after. And all of this is also under a constant process of review, so there's kind of back and forth between me and the principals to see what's needed for the schools as well. And one of the questions that preoccupied me really leading up to the inspection, but actually because I had been in post for a while and really wanted to think about how do I know that all of the training that we're doing is working. Like, we're putting a lot of investment and a lot of time into developing staff, but how do we know it has impact? And when I sat and thought about it, I thought, well, I do know. So if we move on to the next slide, we worked on for both the schools what our kind of philosophy is around professional learning, but also how we then see the impact of that. And really, it wasn't about, I kind of thought I don't need to go out and check what people are doing in the classrooms, because we do that anyway. It's part of our work all the time. We're always in and out of classrooms, and you see immediately maybe if some professional learning you've done, if you don't feel it's had impact, you can see that straight away, and you can be responsive through the next round of professional learning you put in place. So I think that was how we were able to talk with real confidence about seeing that professional learning's had impact, but also our responsiveness to teacher need as well. So again, this document, it wasn't about preparing for Ofsted. It was about how do I check in my role that what I'm doing is the right thing to do. But the result of that was it really helped us get through Ofsted, because it was a really useful thing to refer to, and you know, it is really, it's part and parcel of our quality assurance systems, which I'm going to talk on a little bit more now. So if we can move on. I think this picture kind of probably gives you a bit of a clue of what I'm going to say here. So we do not, at our trust and in our schools, we don't feel it's necessary to do deep dives to quality assure our curriculum. Now, I don't have a problem with Ofsted doing deep dives. I actually think it's really well suited to a 2-day inspection process where they're coming into a school and they have a short period of time to gather the information they need to try and make a judgment on the curriculum. I don't think it's a necessary process for schools to do, because where we've made curriculum central to all of our systems, it means our school leaders are immersed in the life of the school and its educational focus. So I don't think that now going, oh, let's do a deep dive into this aspect of the curriculum would be the most optimum or the most efficient way for us to sustain that curriculum growth. You know, we're in school every day, and I think we can do a much better job than that snapshot that a deep dive gives you to judge the quality of education in our schools. And I genuinely don't think if I did a deep dive in any of our schools, it would tell me anything that I didn't already know. And actually, if I didn't already know it, I think the question I'd be asking myself was, why didn't the way I'm working day to day with the schools tell me this, rather than focusing on what the deep dive necessarily was telling me, because I feel I should know that already. And I think we can be much more comprehensive and consistent in measuring our strengths and weaknesses. So we did use Ofsted's research documents. So there's the documents that Ofsted wrote when they were explaining how they came up with the deep dives as a process to judge curriculum. And I use those because actually they're really helpful summaries from a really well-resourced team with some really great people in it that give advice actually on how you can understand your schools really well. So I looked at those because I wanted to kind of glean their expertise rather than just copy Ofsted systems. And that was part of a lot of work I did, kind of looking at what a lot of schools do around QA and a lot of reading I did around it. And from there, we developed trust and school quality assurance systems that basically for me is about a constant flow of information from the pupil to the teacher. So the teacher's thinking about what the pupils have learned, and that goes up to the middle leader, to the senior leader, all the way to me, to Stuart as CEO, and then also flowing back down again where we're then responsive to those needs. And that, when Stuart talks about DDI, data-driven instruction, and to be very clear, data is information, not numbers. That's what essentially that means to me. It's about keeping that flow of information going so that we're always responding. And it feels to me as if I can no longer separate quality assurance from school improvement, because the two things just go hand in hand, where we're not just QAing it to find out what's happening. The QA is about developing. So the conversations I have with our school leaders and our middle leaders are curriculum development conversations, but of course that gives me huge insight into what their curriculum thinking is, what stage they're at with their curriculum development. We spend a lot of time unpicking what progress should look like across years, really scrutinising how the curriculum links together and trying to build real comprehensive cohesive plans. And you know, this meant that when we did have the Ofsted inspection, there were no surprises in the schools. You know, when the inspectors maybe queried some things, for example, they did look at maths and they did kind of say, you know, can you talk to us a little bit about this outcome data, what's happening here? But we were already on that. We'd already looked at maths in detail, had a plan, we're taking action to look at our maths training. And we had a training session booked the night that the Ofsted inspector was the first day, and she came and she sat in that training, so it was, she could see straight away that what we were doing about it. And there were a few things that kind of came up that we were able to say, yes, this is what our actions are. So we always knew where there might be things, and we were able to show what action we were taking. And that was because we all knew the curriculum really well. We all knew the rationale behind it. And I think, if anything, that's like developing systems that enable you to get to a position where you really have that confidence is key. And the other side is when things maybe, I don't want to use the word went wrong because it's not that dramatic, but when there were issues, so I think no matter how much we talk to our teachers and our leaders and our middle leaders about, don't do it for Ofsted, you do it because it's the right thing for the pupils. I don't want you to do anything specially for Ofsted. I don't want you to worry about Ofsted. They have a lot of passion about what they do. They have passion for the school, and Ofsted feels high stakes. So much as we try to protect them from that, it's inevitable that some people get nervous. And sometimes you know, on the days of the inspection, leaders might come, or subject leaders might come in or report to the principals that they were really frustrated that they hadn't been able to articulate clearly enough what they wanted to, or some questions they'd maybe found quite difficult to answer. And there were so many of us in terms of the trust team and the leadership team that had conversations with these middle leaders and these school leaders and these teachers about the curriculum so often that it was very easy for us to step in and actually to not take over the conversation, but to participate in that conversation, so that we could then draw out of those teachers and middle leaders everything they'd been doing, and enable them to showcase really effectively all of the work that they had put in. I'm ready to move on. You know, I would say one of the main reasons that we have this established curricular thought is because we are led by Stuart, and this is a quotation is from Stuart, sometimes misattributed to other people, but it was Stuart that said it. If in some schools every meeting on data was replaced with a meeting on the curriculum, those schools would have much better data. And the point is here that rather than spending time tracking numbers, we just need to get much closer to what those numbers represent. And that is, what do pupils know? What can they do that they couldn't do before, or that they didn't know before? And if we stay true to that and treat the curriculum as the progression model, then the numbers themselves change their meaning, and it places the burden of proof on the actual curriculum itself. So a key message I would just say is it's really important to know the school. We are very lucky in that we have a trust that supports us in focusing on what matters. So the main thing that the key performance indicators that go to our trust are around our outcomes and forecasting. They look at attendance carefully, and they really carefully look at our pupil mobility, just to check that there are no patterns developing around pupils maybe leaving the school. And we also seek to always make sure that the questions that we ask are the questions, therefore, that the teachers and that the leaders value. And so we try to keep those questions focused on how good's the curriculum, how good's teaching and learning, how good's behaviour, and how do you know, and then what can we do, or actually what could we stop doing that would help us make the school better. And those are kind of the core of the management conversations, the line management conversations that we have with our senior leaders in school all the time, that I think help us keep the curriculum at the heart of our thinking. And I'm going to hand over to Simon now to talk about something completely different.
Good afternoon, everyone. The part of the course that I'm now addressing is, thankfully for you all, relatively short and straightforward, but I'm going to talk you through something that is very important for us to get right from the outset, because it is one of the things that can trip you up right at the beginning of any Ofsted visit that you have. Clearly, one of the things that we found beneficial is that we have quite a large central team, and the consequence therefore is that we could apply resource that some of the other schools that you represent may not have. So we do appreciate that. But one of the things that I must stress with regard to this area is that preparation is really the key to this whole approach. We decided to undertake a review of our single central record maybe 6 to 8 months prior to any of the Ofsted visits taking place. And that wasn't really designed around the Ofsted situation. It was just to make sure that our records were not getting dusty. They were effectively fit for purpose, and that they contained the relevant information that we needed. We looked at the paper records, our files, we looked at our IT records, we looked at the single central record itself, and we sought some advice as well from external sources, our HR advisors, and also looked at the type of things that we all have access to, like the key, in order that we could make sure that our processes were where they needed to be. So we started working through those things, and we started to find, like many people do, that there are small anomalies that need to be addressed. So first thing was to make sure that we cleared those up, and they might be small errors in the single central record itself. They might be that there's a piece of paper missing from a particular file, or they might be that we needed to do a risk assessment for a particular case or a particular individual to make sure that the information we held was watertight should it be queried. So we did some work. We worked around sorting out those mistakes, and we set ourselves clear targets to get that work done. We also made sure that people who visited our sites had letters of assurance prepared, so that we had that behind us as well, should we ever get any queries later on. So from our perspective, at that stage, it was about getting our house in order. And it was then about setting up a system of review for some of our senior leaders, such as the principals, to regularly check in upon how the single central record was being kept, and also how the background information was being stored and whether it was accurate. We also looked at processes around visitors and safeguarding as well. But we were really trying there to make sure that our house was in good shape should anyone come knocking at the door. As you've heard already, we then did get these 2 different Ofsted visits. However, it's right to say that the approach as far as the single central record was concerned was broadly similar for both types of visits. And that involved a number of different things. Firstly, obviously, their review of our paperwork and our single central record on our IT system. Making sure that if there was anything on there that they were unfamiliar with or that looked out of kilter, that they queried. So, for example, there were particular entries where a date may be slightly different to what you would expect to see. Those were the types of things that flagged up and we were asked directly about. We were also asked about things that are obviously hot topics for for Ofsted, and that was around section 128 checks and around the overseas criminal record checks that we conducted and how that was done. And that part of the conversation went relatively well in both cases. And as long as you're broadly on top of the information that you hold, then those shouldn't cause you any great concerns. That said, we then got the slight surprise that we were queried quite significantly, that's myself and anyone else who was in that part of the meeting, about our general safeguarding processes and procedures. And I would remind all of you that it's worth making sure that your staff actually do make themselves familiar with how the processes work at your particular schools, because it was made clear in one of the meetings that I was in that I wasn't an expert in this area. And the Ofsted assessor effectively said, that's exactly the sort of person I want to speak to, and then proceeded to ask me a series of questions around specifics related to our site and how I should act and who I should speak to. And luckily, I had looked at those things and obviously understood those because of my involvement in the process. But I say again, it's really important you make sure your staff are ready for those types of questions, because they can come at any point. So in a nutshell, what's the way to deal with these two areas? I would say, number one, make a plan early and try and stick to it. Secondly, review all the information you currently hold at the moment and make sure that there are no obvious anomalies in there that need to be sorted out. And then go on to set up a system of review so that you stay on top of that information, and that then avoids difficult questions that you cannot answer later. And finally, please do remind those people who effectively are going to be interviewed, and staff in general, in fact, because you never know who this will be, to actually make sure they are fully aware of the safeguarding procedures. So that's a little brief overview of some of the work that we did. I hope you found that helpful. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Mr. Blake.
Thanks, Simon. I'll be taking you through really the BFS experience and preparing for the Ofsted inspection, but then obviously the course of the inspection itself. I think it's probably fair to say that I'm going to echo some of the things you've already heard, and those are really important and common for our experiences. So the emphasis at BFS was always about being Ofsted ready, and of course not simply led by Ofsted. And I think I was really conscious of driving unnecessary workload for staff. And we really didn't want teachers to have to worry about Ofsted, just teaching great lessons and of course developing the best curriculum for our pupils, and as is their entitlement. And I think it's important to say, although we were expecting the inspection from September onwards, we actually had quite a long wait, and eventually it came in the middle of January. So quite a long time to build up. So we do what we always do, and we focused on our key priorities with a sense of business as usual. So developing the curriculum, quality first teaching, and developing our staff through professional learning, as kind of Sally has outlined already. We did take quite a long time leading up to this, but very much part of our improvement strategy is about mapping the curriculum, making sure that it was well sequenced, and obviously all leaders, but particularly our heads of department, were able to articulate the narrative of the curriculum, the substance of the curriculum, and actually that flows to all teachers as well. And we focused on subject development and therefore our key improvement priorities. Now, we did do some preparation with middle leaders on the deep dives, really outlining the purpose and the expected format with the new framework. And actually, because it was relatively early on with the new framework, we shared experiences that we gleaned from early inspections and what we received on social media as well. And we shared the Ofsted handbook with middle leaders with some of those key questions. So there was kind of an expectation potentially about what they might be asked during that period of time. As Stuart said, we spent quite a long time preparing governors as their important role. And I think one of the best things that we did was actually to organise a governor visit day at the beginning of September. And this is very much part of our kind of quality assurance cycle. But it really ensured that governance took on a real personal feel to it. And actually, our governors are fantastic, and they have a really good, strong understanding of the school. So when an inspector kind of asked, well, how do you know this? It wasn't just a case of, well, we've talked about it in a governance meeting, but actually, because I've seen it in action, I've spoken to the head of department, I've spoken to pupils. So governance takes on a real kind of credible and personal feel as well there. SLT, well, we were well prepared and we've done quite a lot of work behind the scenes, preparing key documentation, and that really allowed us to be ready to manage the inspection, so we weren't on the back foot. So we had briefing sheets really for the curriculum entitlement, principles of teaching at BFS and assessment, the professional learning, as Sally's already outlined for staff, how we try and support staff wellbeing, and some pupil case studies that we may wanted to kind of refer to make sure that we were also pushing the agenda and had clear lines that we wanted to promote with inspectors. Knowing the IDSR is really, really important. That's important because actually you're going to be able to generate from that the possible lines of inquiry and investigation. And as a result, it wasn't particularly surprising with the phone call that there were things the inspector was talking about, and that came directly out the IDSR. We took a long time as SLT to make sure that we understood the new framework. We started off with the draft framework and then the published framework, and we read this inside out, annotated it. We read them together at SLT meetings, highlighted questions, and made interpretations based on our collective understanding of it. But in general, outside of SLT, we tried not to talk too much about Ofsted with staff and really try and manage that sense of anxiety and trying to reduce that significantly. We also set in place kind of really tight guidelines for reception staff and how we would handle the phone call, who that would be passed to, how that would be managed. So there was a real clear sense of organisation there. And also the first kind of, as inspectors arrived on day one, to make sure that was a really professional, well-oiled process. We undertook quite a lot of auditing work, as Simon has already outlined, but really auditing our website and compliance checks, making sure that the information that we wanted on the website was there, and of course our curriculum maps as well. And the inspector had clearly done his homework utilising the information that was out there on the website. So that's a really important thing to note. And we booked supply teachers and arranged cover in advance. And actually, we wanted to make sure that if we needed to relieve teachers or heads of department, we had a bank of cover resources and everything was ready to go. And that made just the managing of what can be quite an intense inspection experience much, much easier. And I think it's really important for me to acknowledge that actually I didn't do this in isolation. I was extremely well supported by the trust, drawing upon expertise, but also capacity as well. So Sally, in her role as Director of Education, obviously we had our principals meetings, our subject teams had reviewed and developed the curriculum, and we had that sense of professional learning opportunities for staff. And we'd spent a long time in September actually focusing on quality first provision. So there was a real sense that staff really knew what we were about and what they were going to say, not because of saying it to Ofsted for Ofsted, but actually these are just things that we really, really believe in. Stuart's already spoken about the Ofsted handbook, and that was really vital, just giving a sense of kind of clarity. And obviously Simon's talked about the SCR policies and website compliance as well. But when you aggregate all of this together, actually what it means is the experience of inspection, because of that support and preparation, meant that actually I could concentrate on making sure that everything was in place, that staff were happy, well informed, and the flow of communication was there. And actually we had everything that we needed, and therefore we felt really, really well prepared. That's me.
Okay, thanks, Tim. All right, so Elstow is slightly different in the sense that we had not called Ofsted in and we didn't know that they were coming. But I would say that exactly the same premise stands, which is that we have to be super, super prepared. So actually, in 2017, when I started at Elstow, I was really clear with all the staff, and I just said, I don't want us to ever be in a situation where we are scurrying around till midnight on site trying to prepare for some kind of inspection. I want inspectors to be able to come in and see what we do. And you know this from any lesson that somebody comes in and watches. If you're preparing it specially, something will happen, and it's very high stakes and it's exhausting for everyone. You've got to really be able to show Ofsted just what you do, and it's got to be, and I said that to the staff, it's got to be what we do all the time. So we knew all the way from 2017 that the way that we were going to do things was going to be about delivering really good, really coherent lessons, And we knew that it would be really important to set those up and develop the curriculum from then, which is what we did. So the other part that you've heard a lot from Sally and you've heard a lot from Stuart, and even Tim and Simon have both hinted at it as well, which is that we're really collaborative. You can't do these in isolation. You can't do these on your own, sitting there late at night. You know, you've got to collaborate. You've got to have really good team building and team development, and also really great communication. Like Sally and Stuart were with me from the get-go. They stayed in. We worked on it together, and Sally especially and I sat and worked out how we were going to sort out the curriculum changes. We organised staff training where we talked through for each of the subjects how we were going to organise leadership of a subject instead of coordination of a subject. Those of us who've worked in local authority schools will know that coordination of a subject kind of looks like, in primary, it looks like just making sure that textbooks or equipment is there. But what we mean here now by subject leadership is exactly what Sally talked about earlier, which is understanding the journey of that subject from early years all the way to year 6 and beyond. And we're still doing that. We're still on that journey, making that as great as we can, but we definitely were a long way along that path. So when Ofsted came in, we could already talk about curriculum vision, and we could talk about leadership of the curriculum, and individual middle leaders were able to say, I'm happy to talk about. And in fact, our history lead was happy to meet with the inspector and talk about the journey of history, including, you know, from different year groups other than the one that she teaches in. And that was really, really important. And the culture had to be one of transparency and openness. As Sally's pointed out, you know, we go in and out of classrooms all the time. We have learning wanders. So nothing that's happening in quality of teaching is not a surprise. We don't do just one-off 1-hour visits to teachers and then disappear forever. We walk around all the time, every day, so we know what we're looking at and we know what support's needed. And if you're going to succeed in something like an Ofsted inspection, these things have got to be in place all the time as your standard work. We made sure that our reading was a real close focus, and that the writing and the maths especially were focused on, because we knew that those were areas that naturally were going to be asked about because they're core curriculum subjects, and we knew that maths was something that had been historically weakness, and therefore we needed to be really robust in how we manage that. So we make sure that all of our work with the trust team and then my work with the teaching team was really aligned to what we want the school to be able to show. So the answer is true. Like, we didn't do anything for Ofsted. We did it for our children and for ourselves to feel good about our teaching world and our teaching life and our alignment with our values. It turns out that also means that you're exactly what, you know, somebody like Ofsted inspectors want to see. Thanks, next slide. Okay, the call. Okay, I'm going to bring Tim in here because I think this is both of us actually. Hi, Tim. Do you want to start with yours, Tim?
Yeah. So our 90-minute call actually lasted about 2 hours, and I think it could have gone on longer. But what I would stress is it actually went exceptionally quickly, and certainly didn't feel like that length of time. In the room, once we'd got that call and we were notified, was myself, Stuart as CEO, Sally as Director of Education, and my Vice Principal, who's also our SENCO. And we'd asked the Leader Inspector about that the approach there, and he was absolutely happy with that. What that obviously meant was there was huge amounts of expertise in the room, which builds confidence, and there's a strength in numbers there. But it actually meant that we could share information, and it created thinking time in between. So we had our post-it notes ready to pass questions between the team. So if we wanted a follow-up question or to respond to something, then we had it there. So we kept that dialogue going. In the context of the call, the lead inspector clearly wanted to know about the school, its context, and the leader's understanding of the strengths and areas for development. And that needed to be really clear and concise. We had an opportunity to promote our our vision and values, talk about the curriculum, our intent, but also the breadth and depth of that and how that flowed across the school and the narrative that we were woven together there. They wanted to know about pupil behaviour and attitudes as well, and also the pupil experience. So talking about character, behaviour, and for us, really importantly, it's something that we wanted to really promote, which is enrichment and enrichment and the entitlement for our pupils on that side. There was some touching upon the previous inspection and the progress since the last inspection as well. And then, of course, there was the discussion about the potential deep dives and which subject areas this was going to be. This felt very much like a mutual decision. I don't know if that's always the case, but certainly in ours, it felt like that. But this was, like I said previously, really led by the IDSR and the lines of inquiry that clearly the lead inspector had established from their own research, like the website, the information. There were 4 deep dives conducted in total. 3 of those I would say we chose, and then 1 that we were perhaps told, and that ours were English, Science, MFL and DT. So yeah, really positive experience actually, and a good way to kind of start. It felt like we had an opportunity to really discuss our school, the strengths, and promote the things that we wanted the inspector to hear and to know as well. But I'll hand over to Sam.
Great, thank you. Actually, Tim's kind of outlined the call, and it was really much the same at Elstow. I would say that the handbook that for us, that would be a really helpful thing to have, because it kind of steers your thinking, because there is a horrible heart-thumping moment when you get the phone call coming through to your office. Everyone, all of us in this will know what that moment is, where you go, oh my goodness. The very first thing I did was call BFS, and I called Stuart and I called Sally, and I said, right, we've had the call, and they came over straight away, and we did exactly the same thing as Tim's just outlined. Then we had that expertise in the room, and when it was more than 90 minutes actually, when that call came in, it was really nice, because while I led it and I had the information to hand that I needed, and that's where the Ofsted handbook does help, because we got those things ready for whenever. Like, there's stuff that you know out of your governance reports and what have you, but they're things you do need to hand, because in the heat of the moment, you can feel a bit kind of like on the back foot. So you don't want to do that. So have all that stuff to hand, easily grabbed, so that when you're asked questions in that conversation, that 90-minute conversation or more, as it will be, you can answer them. And what we found was that in that moment, when I'm trying to think of answers and suggestions as we're trying to work out the structure of that inspection, those post-its from Sally and from Stuart with ideas about what I needed to remember to mention and what have you, really helps slow down your thinking and slow down your talking, and just less panicked and really organised. So, you know, that's really worth doing. And then all of the things that you can see there, we did have the Senko in the room for the same reason, as Tim's mentioned, because there are questions on your approach to send and so on, and they're really important that you can answer them concisely in that conversation. So really, it went really well, but for that reason, our deep dives, we were able to choose, other than the ones that you have to have. I'm reading and maths, we had history, and that was really helpful, because then we were able to go and make sure we got all the things that we needed for that to be successful, and then start mapping out what we were going to do. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, so following the call, obviously it's about getting yourself and your teams ready. So we emailed staff and called a staff briefing at the end of the day. That was led by myself and Stuart, and we were really kind of pushing the key messages there and support to staff to make sure that we were reassuring them. We wanted to make sure that obviously key safeguarding and key messages around quality first provision were there at the same time, and it just enabled everyone to really rally round, really collective response there. Also, I went round and I spoke to the pupils, and that was about setting expectations and the tone of the inspection, also making sure that obviously the letters are distributed about parent view and pupil voice, and that's really something important to make sure that happens, and one of those things that can kind of run away if you're not careful. We ordered some food, some pizza for staff wishing to stay, but again, we really didn't want to emphasize that this was going to be a late night, because the hard work, the preparation had been done in advance. So all staff were encouraged not to remain late, and not to prepare anything special or different or extra as a result. And we decided that there wouldn't be a lesson observation form or anything like that we would ask staff to prepare. So it was just really about normal, excellent practice. And actually, really encouragingly, most of our staff actually left by around about 5:30, and only leaders remained behind. The next part was really about preparing the schedule, roomings and logistics, and there's quite a lot actually to there, and there was a bit of backwards and forwards going on with the lead inspector to get that kind of right. And preparing any other key information for staff or key messages for our morning briefing and arrangements there as well, just to touch base with everyone before everything began. And then finally, it was establishing about how information during the inspection was going to be collected and captured, how that would be reported to an individual. And in this case, in our case, we decided that would be Sally. So after all the conversations or observations that took place and the deep dives, that information would be collated in one single place. And that would give us a barometer of how things were going, but also anything that we needed to respond to as the inspection progressed.
Yeah, so very similar at Elstow. What we did find was that it was really important as we started preparing the schedule and sorting out the logistics. We promised ourselves that we wouldn't do anything different for Ofsted, and we didn't. So we didn't change anything about the timings for lessons or which lessons they were going to be. We didn't alter any of the timetable at all over those 2 days. And we found that to be really important, because that calmness that you need, which is that our message was, this is no different to the normal 2 days, except that there are people going to be coming and watching. Just be your normal, amazing, excellent selves and do exactly what you normally do. Please don't do anything different. Don't at the last second start changing things, because that will be really hard to manage and the children won't know what you're doing either. So we kept everything the same. And that was why when we spoke to children about what was happening, we just simply told them that there would be just some people coming in to come and watch some of the teaching and talk to some of them and some of the lessons and just be their usual wonderful selves. And that's really all we told the children. We didn't give them a lot more information than that, because it just needed to be some two normal days. We didn't need anything more than that. Okay. Day one at Elstow. Okay, so this is where Simon came into his own with the SCR and the safeguarding. That was first, and that was quite rigorous and quite thorough. But actually, all of that work had been done in the autumn term, step by step. So as far as we were concerned, because the inspection at Elstow came at the very start of the spring term. In fact, rather amusingly, after the 2 days, the inspector said, well, I'm sure you're all ready for a break. And we were sort of like in the very first week, and it was 2 more days or 3 more days to the weekend, and it was something like 6 weeks to half term. So we really did get us right at the start. So there was no break coming. We focused really on the quality of education, and we made sure that when we were giving Julia time, the teacher who was talking to the inspector about the subject, the day before, we'd actually spent some time with her just saying, right, so just remind us, and she talked through the curriculum that she was familiar with and what she'd done, and we reminded her about the knowledge organisers and all the other aspects of the curriculum that she was familiar with, including any observations of teaching that she'd done, and how she'd impacted upon the coherence of that curriculum going through the school. So we did practice that with her the night before, just so that she was calm and ready and she'd remembered all that she needed to remember. We also had some time with the Senko, and you can see there it talks about graduated response charts. These are something that we have done at Elstow since I've been there in 2017. And they are a form of each class and each year group managing all the different varied needs, and it's something specific to us that we have that helps track. And our Senko meets with all of the teams half-termly, and in response to those, we then change targets for individual children, and we look at whole class teaching and so on. So we just talked through and made sure that these were updated and that all the teachers had reminded themselves of the children on those. They knew, they have them all along, but just, to bring them to the forefront. And then we made sure that we got any parental feedback and we'd had a look at it. And I reminded myself historically of anything that had come in as some kind of complaint or concern, and then how I dealt with it, just so that I got it at the front of my mind. But really, our focus was on those lesson visits and on being able to do the logistics around meeting teachers. We just spent a bit of time working that out. We only had one inspector, so actually the management of that one person for that Section 8 was not too difficult. And we drew up, and it makes me smile actually, because you can see there it's not really a very exciting plan at all. And the idea was for this inspection plan, we actually did this in advance, but we had to sit with the inspector on each of the 2 days where we had these plans and talk through what she'd seen and then what else she'd seen as a result of that, because she sent through some timings which are sent through the day before the first day. And she had made an assumption that that the children wouldn't be in until 10 to 9, and our children came in at 20 past 8. So she lost half an hour of what she'd imagined was her time. So we had to spend a bit of time making sure that she got to see the people that she wanted to see. So the logistics of it, myself and the deputy worked on, and we really didn't involve all the teachers in any of the worry of this. We just told them the bit that was going to concern them where we could, so that we were as much as possible minimizing, the concern that there were people walking around, and keeping that, that kind of feeling of being wound up really low down, and as much as possible just running a normal day. On day 2, obviously we had feedback on day 1, and Stuart was involved in that, and we listened very carefully at that in that time to make sure that we got ready then on day 2 any of the extra areas. Now this stuff, actually you can get this ready way before any kind of inspection. In our Ofsted handbook, the things like exclusion data, you'll know any of the ins and outs to your school. We report on them to the trust anyway, so both Tim and I know who the pupil movement, we know our basic numbers, and each of the censuses that are done each term obviously tell you your pupil population in any case. So just know where they are and have them to mind, because it's actually then not very difficult to be able to talk some of those key they're quite short meetings, but they are quite sort of a bit like the SCR. They're like attention to detail and just making sure that you know the answers, and they are really straightforward. They're not really a discussion, they're just explanation about what's happening. Teachers, interestingly, some teachers were called in and they thought they were getting feedback, and actually they were asked, what do you think of the leadership? Which was quite interesting, because I didn't know that was going to happen, and nor did they. So it's really important that you spend time. Again, you can't do this for Ofsted, you can't do this at the drop of a hat. You've got to make sure that your culture is open and honest and transparent, and as a leader you've been round all your classes and you spend time listening to your teachers explaining what it is that they need help with, and making sure that you know that quality of teaching and what they're doing. So very interesting, especially that talk of work-life balance. And I'm sure this isn't, the remote education obviously wasn't an aspect of the inspection that we went through, but that coming through, and work-life balance and workload and what have you, these are going to be areas that you're going to need to probably be really mindful of. Okay, thank you. And then day 2, obviously you can see we wrote all over it. It's a very scruffy document, because we then added to it and changed things as we needed to, dependent on the changing kind of requirement as we went round. And one of the things that we did do was we made sure that teachers and anybody who'd been watched had an opportunity to tell us really straight after they'd had a conversation with the inspector about what they'd said and any concerns that they'd had, or anything that they felt had been asked about that they hadn't answered particularly well. And again, you need that transparency and honesty to say, oh, this didn't go too well. And so I got emails, or I got phone, a quick message on WhatsApp saying, I've just spoken to them. This is what happened. This was the cause. So myself or Stuart, we were able to go down and find the inspector in the corridor transitions between things, and just pick up a little bit, add a little bit of depth to something, or clarify something that we felt might not have been made as clear as it needed to, and putting in a little bit of concrete between the bricks, as it were, so that the whole thing felt really aligned and really solid. So that transfer of information was really helpful and really useful, and it was a suggestion of Stuart's, which was really useful indeed. So phonics, the discussions with middle leaders. Yes, Ofsted used this language of intent, implementation and impact, but actually we found that really when we had done work with our team over the previous few years, which Sally had led with us, we got our curriculum leads to hold short explanation sessions with the whole staff on their subject, on what it involved and what the journey of it was, and what the resources were that they were expected to use, and what kind of outcomes they were expecting to see, and what kind of links to the writing curriculum, so that by the time we got to something like this, they could talk it. The use of assessment was really helpful, because we were all very clear anyway about what we assess and how we assess and why. And we've worked a lot since then on our data-driven instruction and on that light touch but weekly feedback for pupils on maths and reading and writing that we do now. And that's come from this time to make sure that that formative assessment is really clear. And so that's something I would really recommend that you look into. All of our teachers know their outcomes, and all of the leadership know their outcomes. And we made sure that in any case, we'd got that information to hand. Obviously, internal data isn't interrogated or asked for, but have it to hand to guide what you talk about when you say that you know that there is improvement in the outcomes, and you can explain how you know, even though it's not going to be looked at. The pupil behaviour and attitudes, that's something that we found very interesting. We do have a look at the behaviour that you have in your school, and think about your behaviour policy, and whether all of your staff are consistently enacting what you expect to see, and your senior leadership supporting it. Because again, like all of the rest of this, like you can't do it on the day, like you can't just suddenly do it. It needs to be just part of your standard practice. And so all of our children and all of our staff were able to talk confidently about how they're expected to behave and what happens if they don't. And teachers were able to say how senior leaders support them, and how we communicate to parents. And we're also really honest if something has gone a bit wrong, about how we use that to try and improve how we do things, because we always know that we've got to improve. And staff professional development, we have that in our school, and we record our sessions, but also it was something that Sally was able to support, and that I was able to then talk about how we think about how teachers become better at their subject through understanding cognitive science and being research-led, and thinking about that research-led practice that we put in place. So those things really helped.
So for BFS, we were subject to a Section 5 inspection with 3 inspectors, and that meant that all grades were open. Obviously, with day 1, there was real focus on the SCR and safeguarding, and then the quality of education next, really through those chosen deep dives. I said there were 4, but actually there were 5. They included history, English, science, MFL, and DT. And actually, that was really good for us. There were some real strengths within the school, and we really wanted to promote them. So we felt really positive about it. Following the call, we also knew that there were going to be other areas of investigation. There was going to be an in-depth scrutiny of pupil movement, and that was something that we were prepared for and ready for as well. Exclusions, SEND, and our real approach through quality first provision. So we needed to articulate that really clearly, and actually inspectors needed to see it in action in the classrooms, which they did. Because Wednesday was our electives day, a day for enrichment, that was an opportunity for us to promote our enrichment and electives on the Wednesday afternoon. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see the outline. And you can see actually it's quite a complex web here of different activities that are going on. And that's one thing I would say to be kind of prepared for. The inspector sent me a draft kind of version, and actually I ended up kind of putting little bits in and making sure that everything was coordinated. And it is an intense process, and it will kind of flow. And once it starts, you've got to really keep up with it. So make sure the scheduling is there and serves you. So you can see the three different inspectors. They each had their key areas in focus. So obviously the lead inspector started with a scrutiny of the SER and safeguarding. Others went out on lesson visits, meeting with the heads of departments, conduct the deep dives, and you can see that throughout there's a very, very clear schedule. And again, nothing is random. It's all clearly targeted to serve the needs of what they're kind of looking for. And you can see the pupil discussions as well. And I'd say plan for roomings. Roomings and logistics are a really important part of the inspection. But let's talk about the deep dive. So we've gone to the next slide. 5 deep dives were conducted, and like I said, they were driven by the initial phone call and those lines of inquiry. I would say nothing is random. It's deliberate evidence collection, sense checking the intent as outlined by leaders through that initial phone call. Obviously, discussions with middle leaders were really, really important about the curriculum, selection, prioritization of knowledge, and the sequencing and narrative of that as well. They were also interested in assessment, so how assessment was used to inform the development of the curriculum and future planning or adaptations. The lesson visits that were conducted, in our case, they were conducted with middle leaders. That was our preference, but it could have been the senior leadership team. But actually for us, it felt like a really good opportunity for our middle leaders to do what they do best and as subject specialists talk with passion about their subjects as they saw it in action. There were obviously the discussions with pupils about their lessons and learning and the work that they'd completed. And they really wanted to know, well, what do the pupils know and how are they building connections between the knowledge, their ability to recall and actually remember learning that has taken place. There was work scrutiny, and some of the time that was asking for books to be collected and taken in by us and delivered to the lead inspector. Other times they came down, the pupils were asked to come down with their books. And of course, there was sampling across the different subgroups as well. And actually the conversations with middle leaders included those book reviews at the same time. So there was lots of questions of tell me what I'm seeing here. What is this about? How does this connect together? And talk me through the curriculum and really sense checking, again, the intent that was there initially. And there was discussions with teachers as well about how the curriculum informs their choices of content and sequencing that takes place and how learning takes place over a course of lessons and how that connects. And for us, it was also about talking about knowledge gaps and matching lessons to people's needs. And for us, it was really, really important that we made sure that it was about quality first provision, ensuring all of our pupils have access to the best learning and teacher expertise deployed to sort that. So if you've gone to the next slide, it was about discussions with middle leaders framed around intent, implementation and impact. Like Sam was saying, actually, we haven't trained middle leaders, and the Ofsted language isn't the language that we primarily use at BFS. And perhaps that made it slightly harder for us, but actually in other ways, it made it slightly easier in that we were just talking about the things that we love and we're passionate about and our subject leaders are immersed in. And so maybe in some respects that just made it easier, but it is important to note that inspectors are looking for that language and of course teasing that out and making sure it does match up. So the subject curriculum, well, what do pupils know and what they be able to do? What will they be able to do by specific points? So really drilling down into that with heads of department. Inspectors talking to middle leaders wanted to know, well, what are we likely to see when we go into the lesson? What will pupils be learning about in the lessons observed? And linking to the curriculum maps and plans that we had on our website and making sure that that all connected up. What were the endpoints? What were the key concepts that we wanted pupils to understand, and in what order were those being introduced in? So where is the sequencing, and have you really thought about it? How do pupils build upon prior knowledge, and how do our teachers build those increasingly complex knowledge bases about the subject or concepts, individual concepts? So how are those mental models being built? How is assessment? Assessment was really important. How is assessment being used to evaluate, but also inform learning that's taking place? Obviously, we do a lot of low stakes formative assessments. So we were able to really articulate the diagnostics behind that and how we use that to inform and adapt the curriculum. But also making sure that assessment had a clear purpose. It wasn't just rote memory of indiscrete facts, but actually how does this support pupils to actually remember in terms of the science of learning, know and retain knowledge, and really making sure that we were able to articulate that memory is the residue of thought. There was a real insistence and understanding of the importance of literacy and reading, a passion for reading, and subject specific vocabulary is very much part and parcel of the curriculum. And that was great because of course we could go into lessons and we could see, the inspector could see pupils reading and teachers really passionate about tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary as well. It was also about pupil outcomes, making sure that that was really clear, but linked to that, how were SEND pupils supported to achieve well and to evidence that in lessons. We were able to talk about our teaching approaches, the resources that we use, and how we'd carefully constructed our resources and booklets in order to make sure that all pupils were successful. And they wanted to know, as they were talking to middle leaders and moving around, about pupils' behaviour, the general experiences, attitudes, and personal development as well. So there's a real expectation that all teachers, all staff were aware of these kind of key areas. And professional development was a really important area to discuss within subjects at whole school level and NQTs as well. They wanted to talk to NQTs and make sure that actually their experience was representative of the wider staff body as well. So that was really day one, very much focused on those deep dives. If we move on to day two, you can see that it's perhaps slightly less intense, but actually in some respects there was a lot that the inspectors wanted to kind of pick up on from day one, or needed to undertake that they hadn't been able to. And our lead inspector had spent a long time obviously going through the SCR and looking at pupil mobility on day one. And actually perhaps that was one of my frustrations. I really wanted the lead inspector to go out and to see the school and see it and live and breathe it, which was actually very much the case of the other inspectors, but the lead inspector was very much kind of tied down in compliance more than anything else initially. Anyway, day two was about governance. How well do governors and trustees know the school, those strengths and areas for development? And again, those visit days really helped here to bring that to life and give it a really rich and candid experience. Behaviour was a real focus, picked up obviously from the deep dives that behaviour is excellent at BFS, but talking to pupils about their attitudes and also experience. And we were able to kind of influence that in some respects by bringing a group of pupils together. And actually I was really pleased to see this in the final reports, that actually the experience that many of our pupils receive at BFS is transformational. And they were able to articulate that, the pupils themselves were able to articulate that really well. Obviously, personal development, which hadn't been a focus on day one, which had been very much focused on the quality of education on day one, whereas day two was about personal development, you know, SMSE, careers, character and enrichment as well. There was analysis of data and attendance data, but again, that was relatively straightforward. Exclusions and our approach with exclusions and our high expectations for behaviour. But I would stress that you need to know your pupils here, the different subgroups and how this has changed over time. And you have to have a really clear narrative around that. There was also a focus on SEND. For us, this was pupils categorization, the support and provision that was in place there. And again, for us as a very small school, it's about knowing your pupils really well. And for us, making the case for quality first teaching and making sure that that matched what was seen in lessons. And for us, that was important that we pushed that angle. And it is what inspectors saw in lessons. So that made it slightly easier, but there is a message and line that needed to be promoted there. Professional learning and staff workload were also touched upon, and NQTs again, getting the experience and voice of NQTs was very much a factor within that. pupil voice and experience. The inspectors went out relatively briefly over lunch to talk to pupils and observe lunchtime and how things, how pupils conducted themselves. There was a continued focus on day 2 as well, with the quality of education and follow-up questions and further areas of investigation. And in our case, they wanted to see music and art. And then there continued to be a scrutiny of pupil movement. So lots and lots still to continue with on day 2. If we move on to the next slide, we'll talk about the final team meetings and feedback. So the inspectors obviously came together at the end of day 2 with a review of all the evidence, and they do go through it piece by piece against each criteria. And the lead inspector led this and asked for evidence against each criteria for security. And that was quite an open discussion. Obviously, Stuart, myself and Sally were in the room, and the lead inspector drew together the expertise and what had been seen. And as he was going through, he was asking for feedback in order to make the individual judgments. And the inspector was very, very clear to call for very specific evidence to support or challenge any judgments that were made. There was some input allowed from leaders during this process, and I would say make your voice heard. If you're not sure about something, or you want to push something, or you just don't think that something fits right, or they've missed something, make it count. Okay, this is very much why you are allowed in the room. And have your handbook ready in your hands and be prepared to push back if you need to. And Sam, I don't know if you wanted to add anything there.
Yeah, that's exactly right, because you are told you won't be able to say anything here. You know, this is just me feeding back, but actually we found that it was an opportunity to get your voice heard at that point. And as Tim's just said, have your handbook and have your stuff ready and be prepared to have that conversation. And you know, it is professional, but you do need to be able to do that. And I definitely benefited from having Stuart in the room as well at that point, because it was quite useful to be able to do that.
So there's a lot of information to take on board there. So thank you ever so much for everyone's contribution. And obviously we will share a recording of this with everybody that's registered. So you will be able to review it and glean some information. And there's been a request for the PowerPoint slides too. So we'll make sure we've got those out. If we could move on 2 slides, please, Sophie, because hopefully if you have found this useful, I'm very excited tonight because I want to share with you an opportunity that we're opening up, and that is our brand new Advantage Schools Knowledge Exchange. So if you could move on again, please. The aims of this are going to be to enable networking between primarily local schools, really like-minded schools whose priority is providing excellent quality of education to pupils, regardless of their background or their prior attainment, to enable the sharing of best practice so that we can get some really genuine school-driven school improvement in standards, providing really high-quality professional learning, and providing support for other schools around the leadership of curriculum and school culture, and to start to really create and curate local subject communities. So there are 3 membership options. You can access the network for no charge whatsoever. So if you join up, we'll give you then priority booking for any events or training we have planned, and there'll be free access to any information sessions like this one, or any discussion forums and networking meetings that we organise between the schools. There's then an option to go for full membership, which would give you access to all of our trust professional development. So any courses and training we've got running, and that includes our annual conference, any masterclasses we do, our subject communities, and drawing on expertise from our school and trust teams. And there's an option there that if you want full membership, you might want it for your whole school, or you can actually just opt in for your senior leadership team. And just to make clear, any schools that are joining us for the Early Career Framework programme that we're delivering with Ambition Institute will automatically get full membership for their early career teachers, their mentors, and their school induction coordinator. And then what we're calling enhanced membership is much more that kind of bespoke support that we can offer to schools around behaviour, culture, curriculum leadership, subject specialist curriculum planning, any training and resourcing, financial planning and resourcing, and mentoring of middle and senior leaders. So we would encourage you to really get in touch and discuss your needs around that. the next slide would just give you a bit of an idea of what we have planned for next year, but we're actually going to kick off in June. So Stuart and I will do 2 free taster events as part of the network. So we'll do one session on curriculum leadership and another on something you've heard us talk about a lot tonight, data-driven instruction, because we view those things as really core to achieving really incredible standards in our schools. They're things we're often asked to talk about, so we thought that would be a good way of introducing to people to the knowledge exchange and helping you understand the kind of thing that we'll be offering. So if you're at all interested, you can head over to our website. You should be able to sign up from there, and from there we'll be in touch to let you know what we have planned. So thank you so much for attending. It's been really great to have so many of you here this evening, and we hope to see you soon in some other events.